In the gray stillness before dawn, the ocean around Pearl Harbor carried a quiet that felt almost fragile. At 0637 on a Sunday morning, a thin periscope sliced through that calm water, trailing behind the silhouette of a slow-moving supply ship. From the bridge of an aging destroyer, a young reservist from Minnesota steadied his binoculars, unsure if what he saw was real or just another trick of the light. But his captain knew better. Lieutenant William Outerbridge had been in command of USS Ward for barely 48 hours when he stepped onto the bridge and looked out toward that drifting shadow. What he saw would force him to make the kind of decision that divides routine from history. A Japanese midget submarine was slipping toward the harbor entrance, aiming to breach the defenses of a fleet still asleep. What happened next would mark the first American shot of World War II. And yet, the warning that followed would be dismissed, overlooked in the final quiet minutes before chaos unfolded. How did a forgotten destroyer with a reserve crew become the ship that tried to save Pearl Harbor? And why did its fate return to meet the man who fired that first shot? In the decades before that fragile morning in 1941, USS Ward had already lived a full life. Built in the final year of World War I, she never saw true combat. Instead, she slipped quietly into 2 decades of stillness, tied to a pier in San Diego while the world around her changed. Her steel aged, her engines grew tired, and when newer, faster destroyers filled the fleet, Ward became little more than a relic that simply refused to sink. But war has a way of calling even the forgotten back into the light. In early 1941, as tensions with Japan tightened like a vice across the Pacific, the Navy needed every hull it could float. Ward was hauled from her long slumber and recommissioned. The crew that stepped aboard her decks was not a hardened combat unit, but 85 naval reservists from Minnesota, men who had drilled on cold Midwestern weekends, who memorized procedures from books rather than battles, who had never taken a destroyer to sea. They carried a sense of duty, not experience, onto the rusted plates beneath their boots. Their first months together were awkward, disciplined, determined. Under the watch of Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, they learned the rhythms of a destroyer, the thump of boilers waking, the precise swing of torpedo davits, the tense silence of dawn watches. By autumn, their drills became instinct. By winter, they were no longer a reserve crew, they were Ward's crew. 2 days before the most defining moment of their service, command passed to Lieutenant William Outerbridge. He understood the Pacific in ways few others did. He had watched Japan prepare for war during his years on the China Station. He recognized the hard edges of determination in their naval strategy, the patience behind their movements. When he stepped aboard Ward on December 5th, 1941, he didn't see an obsolete destroyer. He saw a responsibility. The pre-dawn hours of December 7th began without drama. A minesweeper zigzagged across the harbor entrance. A patrol plane circled lazily overhead. Ward traced slow patterns through the dark water, her engines humming at 15 knots. Lookouts scanned the horizon with the resigned focus of men who expected another quiet shift. Then came the first spark of unease, a signal from the minesweeper Condor at 0357 reporting a possible submarine. Outerbridge was pulled from his sleep, still in a bathrobe as he reached the bridge. For nearly 2 hours, Ward swept the entrance. Sonar pings echoed against empty water. Nothing surfaced. Nothing stirred. At 0435, the crew was released from general quarters. Another false alarm. Another nervous report in a month filled with them. Yet history often hides behind moments that seem unremarkable. And just as the crew settled back into their routines, a supply ship approached the harbor with a silent shadow trailing behind it. A patrol plane marked the water with smoke. A young officer called for Outerbridge. The real beginning had arrived. The quiet surface of the Pacific shifted as USS Ward surged ahead, her engines straining against the water. What had begun as a routine patrol was now a race measured in seconds. At 0637, when Lieutenant Outerbridge raised his binoculars and focused on the strange silhouette behind the supply ship Antares, the truth settled in with chilling clarity. This was no false alarm, no nervous misreading. A Japanese midget submarine was attempting to slip into Pearl Harbor. Outerbridge's orders cut through the ship like electricity. All engines ahead full. General quarters. Man, all guns. Prepare to ram. Within moments, the once calm deck exploded into motion. Men abandoned breakfast, leapt from hammocks, sprinted to their stations. They had drilled for months, but drills never carried the weight of this moment. This was real. Ward accelerated from 5 knots to 25 in less than a minute, an astonishing feat for a ship built before many of her crew were born. Every vibration of her hull told the same story. They had one chance. The submarine ahead moved steadily behind Antares, unaware that death was charging toward it. It did not dive. It did not change course. It simply crept forward, confident in the secrecy of the early morning haze. At 100 yards, Ward's #1 gun fired. The shell screamed over the water and missed, passing just above the conning tower. 15 seconds later, gun #3 fired. The range was 50 yards. This time, the shell struck, with brutal precision tearing into the submarine at the waterline, right where the conning tower met the hull. The impact lurched the submarine to starboard. A wound that deep at that angle was fatal. Ward roared past at full speed and released 4 depth charges set to detonate at 30 feet. The ocean erupted behind her, great columns of white water rising with each underwater blast. Then came the silence, broken only by the ripple of oil spreading across the surface. Nothing else remained. At 0653, Outerbridge sent his report. We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon a submarine operating in the defensive sea area. It was clear, direct, unmistakable, and yet no one believed him. The message was passed up the chain with low priority. Perhaps the crew was mistaken. Perhaps it was nerves. For weeks, submarine sightings had been reported and dismissed. Why should this one be any different? The consequence of that disbelief unfolded exactly 1 hour and 2 minutes later. At 0755, the sky above Pearl Harbor darkened with the shadows of 183 Japanese aircraft. Dive bombers peeled downward. Torpedo planes skimmed the water. Fighters roared overhead. Battleship Row vanished beneath explosions and fire. It was the opening strike of a war that would reshape the world. But inside that hour, before the bombs fell, before the flames rose, USS Ward had already fired the first American shots of World War II. She had already tried to sound the alarm. She had already seen the danger coming, and she had been ignored. For the men of USS Ward, the hours that followed the submarine attack were filled with confusion, frustration, and a rising sense of dread. They had done everything right. They had identified an enemy vessel, engaged it with precision, confirmed the hit, and reported the threat exactly as protocol demanded. Yet the harbor behind them remained calm, unmoved, unchanged. No alarms sounded, no defensive measures were taken. Their warning dissolved into the morning routine of a Sunday fleet at anchor. As explosions thundered across Pearl Harbor at 0755, Ward was still patrolling outside the entrance, watching the smoke rise in towering black columns. They listened to frantic radio calls, heard the panic in voices of sailors who had been caught unaware, and understood with painful clarity that their report had never been believed. The cost of that disbelief would echo across the Pacific. 2,403 Americans dead, 4 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed before they ever left the ground. In the days that followed, Ward continued to hunt for more submarines, dropping more than 130 depth charges on suspected contacts. None yielded confirmation, and as the shock of the attack settled into grief and anger, doubts crept in. Had Ward truly sunk a submarine? Had they fired on a shadow? Had a reserve crew on an antiquated destroyer misread what they saw in the dim morning light? Even the Navy's commendation for Lieutenant Outerbridge reflected that uncertainty. His Navy Cross cited him for attacking and possibly sinking an enemy submarine. Possibly, a single word that diminished the certainty of the men who stood on Ward's deck and watched the enemy vessel list and disappear beneath the waves. Without wreckage, without bodies, without undeniable physical proof, their story remained suspended in an uncomfortable limbo. Yet the truth had not vanished. It simply lay hidden beneath 1,300 feet of Pacific water. The Japanese midget submarine program, hastily added to the Pearl Harbor attack plan, had never been embraced by its own commanders. Aviation officers warned that using the submarines risked alerting the Americans too early. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto approved the mission anyway. 5 mother submarines carried their fragile 2-man craft across the Pacific. All were launched in darkness. All were lost. 1 was sunk inside the harbor. 1 ran aground and was captured. 2 disappeared forever. And 1 Ward submarine became the first confirmed Japanese casualties of the Pacific War. But for 61 years, the proof rested on the testimony of the men who pulled the firing lanyard. Search teams in 1991 and 2000 scoured the ocean floor outside Pearl Harbor, guided by sonar and magnetometers, but found nothing. It was not until 2002, when advanced side-scan technology became available, that researchers finally spotted the submarine, intact, upright, undisturbed, and pierced by a 4-inch hole exactly where Ward's number 3 gun had struck it. A single perfect shot, a moment long doubted, a truth finally rising from the deep. From a strategic perspective, the sinking of the midget submarine by USS Ward is more than an isolated engagement. It stands as one of the earliest and clearest examples of how warning, even when accurate, can fail inside a rigid command structure unprepared for surprise. In the tense weeks leading up to December 7th, the United States received scattered intelligence hinting at Japanese intentions, yet none of it coalesced into a vivid picture of imminent attack. The Pacific Fleet trusted routines that had never been tested by an adversary willing to gamble everything on a single, devastating blow. Ward's unheeded report exposed the fragility of that system. At every level, officers hesitated to elevate the message, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of disbelief, that war could truly arrive in the quiet of a Sunday morning. It was a moment when human judgment, shaped by assumptions of peace, failed to match the approaching reality. In later analyses, military historians would describe the hour between Ward's warning and the first bombs as one of the most costly lapses in American naval history. Globally, the attack on Pearl Harbor marked a pivot point. Japan's decision to strike was a declaration that diplomacy had collapsed and that their imperial ambitions could only be secured through force. The coordinated use of carriers, midget submarines, and surprise tactics demonstrated a modern style of warfare that stunned observers across the world. For Axis powers, the attack signaled Japan's commitment to full-scale conflict. For the Allies, it underscored the urgency of unity. Ward's engagement, though overshadowed by the catastrophe that followed, holds its own strategic significance. It showed that even the oldest ship in the sector, crewed by reservists with limited experience, could respond decisively under pressure. It validated the importance of vigilance, readiness, and decentralized initiative principles that would guide American naval doctrine for the rest of the war. And in a broader sense, the moment when Ward fired the first shot reminds us that history rarely begins with spectacle. It begins with a lookout squinting into the dawn, an officer making a difficult decision, a report sent up the chain and left unanswered. The lesson resonates far beyond 1941. Warnings often arrive quietly, and their value depends not only on accuracy but on the willingness of those in power to listen. Long after the smoke of Pearl Harbor faded and the war carried on across continents and oceans, the story of USS Ward settled into the quiet corners of memory. Her steel had been old, her engines temperamental, her crew largely composed of men who had left behind classrooms, storefronts, and winter fields in Minnesota. Yet it was this unlikely combination that produced the first American shot of World War II, an action that went unrecognized for decades, drowned out by the enormity of what followed. Ward continued to serve long after that morning in 1941. She carried troops through island campaigns, survived air attacks, and adapted to roles never imagined when she was first launched. But her final chapter came on December 7th, 1944, when a kamikaze plunged into her hull at Ormoc Bay. Flames raced through her compartments. Her crew fought until there was nothing left to save. And then, in a twist that history seldom writes with such precision, the order to sink the burning ship fell to the man who had once commanded her. Admiral William Outerbridge watched his former vessel burn, then gave the order for USS O'Brien to open fire. Shells tore into the same thin plates he had once trusted with his life. When Ward slipped beneath the surface, she carried with her the first shot of America's entry into war and the last echoes of a crew that had tried unsuccessfully to warn a nation of what was coming. Today, both Ward and the midget submarine she destroyed rest in silence on opposite sides of the Pacific. Their steel is twisted, their decks collapsed, yet their stories remain intact. The number 3 gun, the very weapon that struck the submarine at 50 yards, now stands in Minnesota, weathered by time but still pointing outward, as if waiting for someone to ask what really happened on that gray morning. History remembers Pearl Harbor. It remembers the flames, the destruction, the lives lost. But the first warning, the first shot, the first proof that war had already arrived, that part of the story nearly vanished. USS Ward preserved it, her crew lived it, and the ocean now keeps what they once tried to tell. If this story reminds you of the quiet sacrifices that shape history, share your thoughts below. And if you want to continue exploring the forgotten corners of World War II, join us for the next chapter.